Hello, everyone, and welcome to Let's Talk. Really glad to have you here today and excited for this particular show. I've got a guest I'm personally just thrilled to have on, always love to talk to. Before we get started, though, I always just like to say, please ask questions. So please put your comments in as we go along. I'll try to pull the most relevant questions up, and we can actually ask Kevin these questions live. He's such a fantastic font of knowledge about drug policy, his experiences in government and speaking all across the country. So please don't be shy. Please ask questions. So that being said, my guest for this episode is my friend and someone I consider a mentor, Dr. Kevin Sabet. Dr. Sabet is the president and CEO of Smart Approaches to Marijuana, SAM for short, which he founded with former Congressman Patrick Kennedy in 2013. He's worked in the Clinton, Bush #1, H.W. Bush, and Obama administrations, and he's one of the only drug policy staffers to have ever served as a political appointee in both Democrat and Republican administrations. He just released his second book, Smokescreen, What the Marijuana Industry Doesn't Want You to Know. A few weeks ago, I listened to it in an audiobook. It was fantastic. I actually learned a lot from it, which is saying something for me because I'm very steeped in marijuana science and policy. I do a lot of speaking in that area, but I was enlightened. So I'd highly recommend the book. Over the past decade, you might have seen or read something from Kevin in just about every possible major news outlet out there. So that being said, Kevin, Dr. Sabet, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Aaron. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor. Thank you.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. And I want to say also just live, recorded for posterity. This man is the reason why I probably am doing this show as well as have most of my career. About 5 years ago, Kevin, I saw you speak when I was directing a hospital addiction service line. And I saw you talk on this topic. And I thought to myself, that is what I want to do, to be able to speak like that, to be able to project facts like that. And I came up to you, and the rest is history. And you've been such a fantastic friend and mentor, and I'm just so inspirational. So
well, that's way too kind, because I've become a better at what I do because of you and people like you. But you've been a wonderful friend, and I'm honored to be on the show, but also to watch your career and to see what you've done. There's nothing really that brings me more pleasure than to see kind of the work we're doing bear fruit with a lot of other people, and seeing, what you've done is awesome. So I'm a big fan of Aaron Weiner. Thank you so much for having me and everything you do.
Well, thank you, Kevin. All right. Well, now that we've got our love fest out of the way, we've got a lot to talk about today.
I do have to make one. I already have to interrupt you. I have to make one correction, is that during the H.W. Bush administration, I was like an 11-year-old watching Mr. Belvedere. So you have to say it was the second one, thank God, because it's the first one.
Oh, that's true. That would have been out. Like, why would they be talking to you?
Please stop aging me, please.
Yeah, you'd be like, so Donatello on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles
exactly.
did not use any of this.
Transformers. Yeah, Megatron, I think. Yeah.
All right. Well, but Bush, the second part. All right. But all right. So let's dive in. You just released a new book. Again, I listened to it. I appreciated it very much. But maybe you could tell our audience who might not have read it yet, what is it about, and why did you choose to publish it right now?
Well, boy, when I left the Obama administration in 2011, I wrote a book some people know called Reefer Sanity: 7 Great Myths About Marijuana. And that book I wrote as quickly as I could, as really a sort of a glorified fact sheet in many ways. I mean, it was a fact book disputing 7 myths, because traveling around the country, I had heard so many myths around marijuana's addictiveness and what they've done in the Netherlands, and it's all marijuana medicine and blah, and these kinds of things that really were counter to the science and counter to what people like Nora Volkow from NIDA was saying, and many other very, very smart people who have done really great work. And so I wrote that book very quickly. I did not plan to write this book. This book was some sort of crept up on me slowly, in a very different way than Reefer Sanity. Reefer Sanity was quick. I had an objective. I got it done. It was a platform. It's helped launch SAM. And this book, which here I have in my hand, I really love the cover, which I don't have anything to do with. So I wish I could say I came up with the idea or I designed it or whatever. Didn't do any of that. But with Smokescreen, this was something that was slower because it was really people approaching me over the last couple of years, especially, that had stories to tell me about marijuana, the marijuana industry, everything from how marijuana affected their family to how marijuana affected their state as they were, governing on marijuana in their state. I mean, these are people who were regulating marijuana. These are people who are owners of laboratories that tested the marijuana in their state that was being sold. So it just was such a story that it was all, I had to weave it all together. And it took a long time. It was a very different book than I'm used to even thinking about. And really, it is what the marijuana industry doesn't want you to know. It's what's behind the headlines that we often hear about.
Yeah, and I mean you're known so much, and if you follow Kevin on social media, you'll see he's all about science and data. He's always pushing out journal articles, always pushing out news. And one of the things that was very striking about this book for me was how personal it was, not only in the stories of the people who talked with you, but you sharing some of your own history in terms of what brought you into this line of work and what drives you. But it's really that other side.
Yeah, I really hesitated to include anything personal for a number of reasons. One, I just think people would find it boring. Why would they be that interested in me and what sort of my personal history? And then number two, obviously when you're doing this kind of work, it attracts some people that don't like what you're doing. And unfortunately, marijuana has become somewhat of a religion, I think, for some people. And so when you attack their religion, it's very personal to people, and they say and do things they may normally would not say or do. And so, I have a family now and I want to protect them. And so I was very hesitant to go beyond the policy side, the science, other people's stories. And then I realized I was writing about everybody's story except mine. And the publisher essentially said, actually, that might be one of the most interesting parts. Please, you got to dig deep and write a little bit about it. And so I went through a number of drafts until I was comfortable with what I put out there. But it's all true, and there is stuff in there that is very deeply personal to me and my family and my parents and our family stories.
Yeah, well, I think the why is really, really important. I mean, to go to Simon Sinek and his work. I mean, I think that's part of what draws people to anything is where does that passion come from? But let's get into some of the details of this, because I know I had some questions for you. I was trying to think about, because anyone who watches my show knows that I speak on this often, who's seen me live knows that I speak on this often. I really wanted to try to tap into some of the areas that you have, the experience you have that people might not have heard. So one of the things that you repeat often in your book, this is actually something that both of us talk about to a certain extent, is this idea of an incremental approach. And I know that there were certain elements to the nuance behind this and the specifics behind this that I got from this book. So can you talk a little bit about, when you say incremental approach to marijuana normalization, to commercialization, what does that mean up to this point? And then where do you see that going in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. One of the first reasons I got involved in this at the time that I was getting involved in anti-drug work generally, there was the first initiative in the whole country to legalize medical marijuana in 1996 in California. And, at first I was inclined to support it because I had family members who had suffered from cancer. I thought this was for cancer patients and AIDS patients. I had grown up seeing the deadly AIDS epidemic and how, it was a death sentence to people and people suffering, growing up in California, seeing it up close, knowing people. And so I thought, well, if it provides them some relief, that's good. And then I read the actual law, which basically said anybody who thinks it's helpful can get it. It wasn't about cancer or AIDS. Then I talked to doctors who said we could never prescribe this because it hasn't passed FDA muster. And then I talked to other doctors who said we already have a FDA approved medication for cancer pain based on marijuana and for AIDS wasting and for appetite called dronabinol or Marinol. And I learned all of these things, when I was 17 years old. I was shocked to hear them. And I thought, wow, I bet you most people don't know this. And then I said, well, wait a minute, then why do we need this initiative? And then I looked, deeper and deeper, way back then, that's over, that's 25 years ago, frankly. And over the last 25 years, seeing that this is really about baby steps towards the legalization of all drugs and framing it in a way at the time that people can identify with and they're okay with, that they can give themselves permission to be okay with. And in the mid-90s, the legalization movement banked on the idea that most people are okay if it was presented as medical in a very limited circumstances, medical marijuana, And if they could get that supported, then they could go on to the other things. And boy, have we seen that over the last 25 years. So that's really where we were with marijuana. Now, in terms of what I see, happening now that we have 16 states that have legalized marijuana, is that you now have a lot of those same groups and same people on those boards, et cetera. They've moved on from marijuana. They're either talking about, the psychedelics, and I just did a debate on Intelligence Squared about psychedelics against Rick Doblin, and I was joined on my side by the chair of psychiatry from Columbia, Jeffrey Lieberman, and we debated them about the legalization of psychedelics. Now, if you were to tell people 5 years ago that we'd be talking about legalizing anything but marijuana, you'd be laughed out of most policy rooms, unless you were around people that were really studying the issue. Now we're talking about that. And now we're also talking about looking at other drugs like heroin and cocaine. So this is the incremental approach. It's little by little. And it's, you're not okay with legalizing heroin today, but you might be okay with legalizing psychedelics in a limited way today. And then maybe tomorrow you'll be okay with psychedelics in a broader way. And then next week we can talk about heroin in a limited way. So that really, sorry for the long answer, but that really is the incremental approach.
Well, and it's true. The question is, what is palatable? It's like, what is the least perceptible difference? It's kind of like when you talk about if the temperature is rising, you raise the temperature by a degree, maybe nobody notices, but you raise it by 10 degrees, you raise it by 5 degrees, people feel that. You can make a 5-degree change 1 degree at a time. People don't necessarily see that.
That's right. No, that's exactly that. And that is exactly what happened. It's a great analogy, Aaron. That's exactly what's happening.
Yeah. And it's something that struck me as well, particularly in this age of COVID, is when we think, bringing it back to marijuana for a second, this idea that a group of people with a product that they're going to say is useful is they're going to go to a legislature and say, we want you to go around the FDA and provide a separate dispensing system so that you can offer to the public. We want you to call it medicine. We didn't even do this for COVID vaccines when people were dying and we're in a pandemic. You know what I mean? We did our due diligence. And you're 100% right. We actually have multiple FDA approved cannabinoid medications, like when we invoke that word, that are there. So it is possible to play by the rules here. You don't have to go around it.
It is possible. And I've talked to people, I've debated this issue for so long, and I believe in constructive debate and dialogue. One of the things President Obama told his political appointees was that, you can disagree with people, but never be disagreeable. And I've tried to hold to that. It's hard in the age of Twitter and social media, but it's more important than ever before. And the reason I say that is because, I like to engage with people I disagree with. I mean, that's how you get smarter. That's how you learn more. I don't agree with the echo chamber. And so, often when I'm debating folks, when we're in the green room 5 minutes before, or if we have sometimes there's like a dinner the host puts on, and they think you want to sit on the opposite sides of the table from the other person. And usually, I'd say 95% of the time, I'm fine with sitting next to them. I'd like to sit next to the person actually and talk to them. And so, I remember hearing once from somebody I debated who said, Kevin, that sounds great about, it's possible to go through the FDA and do that. But, when you're dying, you don't have time. You don't have 5 years to wait for some FDA approved thing. And if this helps somebody with a few months to live, why is that a bad thing? And, I don't necessarily disagree with that part of it. I mean, you could, I've advocated for compassionate use programs in a very limited way. Now, that's very different, though, than what these legislatures are doing and what the initiatives have done, just opening up the floodgates. So, you really have to make that distinction.
One of the things that I've noticed actually, and you're very clear about that in your book, I actually just random thing about maybe like one or 2 months ago, I popped into it was on the Clubhouse app. You were in a Canadian marijuana industry Clubhouse.
The last time I ever used Clubhouse, I think. Anyway, yes.
But I saw you there and I popped in and you were talking about it. And I remember one of the women in there was saying, you know what? You are not the villain that I thought you were. You were actually a lot more reasonable than I thought that you would be based on what I'd heard about you in the news. And I think that really comes across in the book, and it's possible to have these discussions in a constructive way. And I think that keeping the conversation up here and not letting it devolve into Twitter troll fests is important, but it's really tough to do. Quick thing, we just got a comment actually from Herbert on YouTube asking, is your book going to be published in German or not?
I would love. I was hoping I could reply in German. My German isn't good enough to reply, so I'm not going to embarrass myself. There are some talks for translating, and so into a couple different languages. So I'm happy to, if he would like to get in touch, we can talk about it. I'd love to get it. It's the book business. We could have a whole discussion about the insanity of the book business and how every other industry has been disrupted. The book selling business has been disrupted, but the book publishing business, it's still kind of back in 1930, and I'm not going to go on a diatribe about publishing right now, but I absolutely would be open for it to be translated into multiple languages, and there is some talk of that happening. And if he has some leads for German, I'd love to work with him.
Marvelous. So before we get to the next question, we have one other question about the use of the term. Why are we in our work? We try to avoid the term medical marijuana, use medical cannabis instead. What I want to throw out there, I would love to hear Kevin's thoughts. My quick thought is I try to avoid the word medical entirely, and I use the term therapeutic. And I also try to, because I think the word medical has there's a structure and an underpinning, a regulatory underpinning that gets invoked when you use the word medical. I also like to be very specific if we're talking about cannabinoids, because there's some things that say CBD has been shown to be useful for that THC is not, to try to distinguish between a plant versus a chemical. But Kevin, what's your thought on that as well?
I'm usually a little bit more practical, and I use the term that I think is going to be most understandable to my audience. And so when, it's tough. So I think, I actually talk about this in the book a little bit, because a lot of people say, why don't you use the word cannabis at all? Why you should just use the word cannabis. And I think, first of all, the marijuana, what I'm talking about is not the cannabis genus from the cannabis plant. And I mean, it is technically, but really what it's being turned into is not what cannabis is, the old plant. And so I sort of distinguish cannabis. I refer to things as cannabis if there's something from a long time ago. In Europe, that has been less emotionally charged. So I'm much more likely to use the word cannabis for everything when I'm in Europe. When I'm somewhere else, I'm more likely, when I'm in America, in the Americas or in other places, I'm more likely to use the word marijuana. It really depends on the audience. In terms of medical, yeah, I agree with you. I mean, but of course, most people just know medical marijuana as what they can get from a dispensary. Whereas you could say medical or therapeutic cannabis could be what you could get from a pharmacy, but it gets very confusing very quickly. And I try and kind of keep it simple, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. So this is a really good transition, I think, to my next question, which is that when I'm presenting on the current state of marijuana and how it's changed, as you mentioned, one of the points that gets some of the biggest wows from the audience, like I didn't realize that, is how much more potent it is right now. And on average, there was a study that came out about 6 months ago that showed that the average potency in the US recreational market is about 21.5%. And that's actually been rising steadily since the mid-90s, when it was still 3 to 4%. And so even just the visual that I like to use of that, like one joint of today's weed is like lighting up 7 Woodstock joints at once in terms of the THC content. Given that, but for decades before then, from Woodstock until the 90s, even maybe for centuries beforehand, marijuana potency had been pretty steady. What's been going on in the past 2 decades that's led to this metamorphosis?
We've become better farmers. We're much better at agriculture we've learned so much about agriculture and genetic breeding in the last 25 years than in any time before that. The advancements made because of technology are incredible. And so we have learned to breed plants very selectively. We've learned how to get, marijuana is a very complex plant, actually. It has hundreds and hundreds of components, most of which we don't know a lot about. Contrast that, by the way, with the opium poppy, which is a relatively simple plant, actually, or coca. But marijuana is very complex. And so, we know that THC, at least, is one component that binds to receptors in a way that makes you high. That's what gets you high. And so we've learned to breed that THC very selectively and then extract that THC directly, so you don't need it in a sort of its agricultural, or what they call flower form, but you can use it in these oils and these waxes and dabs. I actually, just what I was doing, I just brought up a picture I want to show everybody of what was first place in terms of the marijuana concentrates in Colorado about a week or two ago. This won first place in the contest. And, if you see that, this looks like something from Swarovski's factory or something. I mean, this has nothing to do with a psychoactive drug. It's a crystal or it's glass or something. I mean, it's crazy what we're seeing now. So it is really a completely different drug in my mind. And so, I've heard Keith Humphreys talk about new marijuana and old marijuana. This is definitely new marijuana. This is not the old marijuana, which is really anything from maybe 5 or 10 years ago, and before that, from thousands of years ago.
So here's a question, a follow-up there, that because I've been musing about this too. Like, clearly, the better farmers aspect is part of it. The extraction aspect is part of it. But for there to be a product, I feel like there has to be demand for the product. And so for your estimation, given your 30,000 foot view of this subject, it seems to me, well, let me put this out there. It seems to me that really what people are chasing are these really strong, fast, intense highs. Do you feel like that's where the demand for these intense products are coming from? Or is this just simply kind of like a, we do it because we can situation?
No, the demand is there. The demand is definitely there. And, it's a small proportion of people that consume the majority of the marijuana in any given market. And the marijuana so on the one hand, the sort of the prevalence is up, but the volume of use is up, and not just the volume, it's the intensity because of the potency. So yes, we are seeing people quickly move to high potency products. They may not all be dabbing or using concentrates, but they could be using high potency edibles all the time, very high potency smokable marijuana, which can still get up to extremely high levels that are just off the charts from our historical averages. So I think we're seeing all of that.
Absolutely. Well, so the next question that I have is about the marijuana legalization, commercialization movement, and social justice. And this is actually a really good time to bring in Luke, your second command over at SAM, asks, what is my favorite part of the book? And I think my favorite part of the book was the intersection between the marijuana industry and what's going on there, and some of these social factors, and how it's essentially hooked its carriage to this movement. There's a phrase that you use a lot called a false dichotomy, that either we have to do complete prohibition or kind of essentially the free-for-all commercialization that we're seeing, regardless of what we're hearing about how there's regulation. I mean, if we go into the weeds on this, like here in Illinois, we allow for advertising. We've got products called Girl Scout cookies and mangoes. I mean, there's no minimum setbacks from schools, high schools, daycares. I mean, we could go on for a long time about this. So it really is, the pendulum has swung to the entirely other side, and you don't have to do that. There's a lot of mid grounds where you can unhitch those things.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So specifically though about social justice, because that's kind of like the rallying cry we hear a lot, things about how much harm the drug war has caused and that therefore we need to be selling pot commercially. Here in Illinois, there was a study that, not even a study, a news article that just came out in the Chicago Tribune about a month ago that I pushed out on social media, that there were a grand total of 0 Black or brown owners of marijuana dispensaries in a state where we were told this was about raising up minorities. And this to me was echoing some of the concerns we heard when I was directly, in the halls of Congress here in Illinois, speaking with the chair of the Illinois NAACP against marijuana legalization. Because she realized you do not raise up a community by selling pot to your neighbors, right? That's actually the last thing the inner city needs. So where does this disconnect come from? How is it possible that we have this massive movement, many of which honestly are white people, saying this is for social justice, when the African Americans and the leader of the NAACP across the country as well is saying, no, this isn't good for us? How do we get that disconnect?
It's a huge disconnect, and it really comes to the fact that the marijuana movement is very clever, and they hitch, their ride to something that is popular, that they think they're going to get more, followers from. And so they were smart. I'm not saying every single one. I think there are some genuine social justice activists that I think are misguided, but I think they're genuine in their activism. But by and large, you have a movement and an industry that is mainly sort of older white men. Really all ages, but you do have like a lot of the sort of libertarian thread white men who all of a sudden are social justice activists when it's convenient. And that, I think it's very perverse, because the people that are going to benefit, that are already benefiting from marijuana, are people that, you look like you and me, Aaron. That, let's just be honest. They're not the people from minority communities and from communities of color, the traditionally disenfranchised communities at all. Like you said, zero in Illinois. It's zero everywhere. I mean, it's just such a small number wherever, even with the efforts that are made. Sometimes there are huge set aside programs, they all fail, and the people in charge of those have admitted that they fail. And so now we're adding something else to essentially keep people down. In my mind, where we have the liquor stores that are disproportionately in these communities. We have the lottery purchased, places to buy lottery. We have, we don't have grocery stores. We don't have healthy food and healthy activities. We don't have good schools. But we do have, payday loans, so you can, get an advance as long as you pay 73% interest. And we have marijuana stores now, and so in my mind, I just cannot believe how this is being used like that, when there are reforms that need to be made in the criminal justice system, whether it's with our drug laws or other things. You shouldn't go to prison for 6 months for stealing a banana because you're hungry. I mean, there are structural inequalities that we absolutely have to look at. But this issue of that by legalizing marijuana, we're also going to keep people out of the criminal justice system. We haven't seen that happen in legal states. We've seen arrests in some categories go up. We've seen we have seen disproportionate arrests persist. So you could do the decriminalization, in the right way. I also don't think the right way is, a $10 fine and go on your way. I mean, if you're given a $10 fine, 15 times in a month, well, maybe you have a problem that needs to be addressed by a health professional. And so we have to be smart about what that looks like also. But there are ways to construct that. Whereas legalization, we always know how that movie ends, whether it's alcohol, tobacco, prescription drugs, all of these things. It doesn't end well for vulnerable communities. Last point, Aaron, you and I, if we have a drug problem, we can get help. We can probably pause our job for 6 months and come back once we're recovered. We have supportive families around us that have means that can also help us in our time of need. A lot of these communities don't have any of those privileges. So the idea that we're going to just, increase addiction rates and dependencies in these communities when they already are given a very difficult hand in life, to me makes no sense.
Well, absolutely. And so I remember very clearly, I was in a debate with Senator Staines, one of the co-sponsors of the bill here in Illinois. And when she was talking about this issue of social justice and people filling up jails with marijuana possession charges, I actually had to step in and say, so are we both on the same page that we've decriminalized marijuana for the past 2 years and that there's nobody in jail right now for marijuana possession? And because it seems like we gloss over that, and that that you could even legalize possession without legalizing sale. And that gets completely overlooked in this discussion.
Totally. And it gets overlooked because that doesn't make money, right, Aaron? I mean, the decriminalization and these kinds of things don't make money. It's really about the profit motive at the end of the day, and promising some communities some giveaways, will throw you a bone. They don't even throw them a bone, by the way, at the end of the day, but that's what's promised. It's condescending, it's perverse, and it's just very, very sad.
One last point on this, as long as we're talking about underserved and underprivileged and vulnerable populations. So there was a study that just came out about, I want to say like 4 months ago. I again pushed this out on social media, that was specifically looking at if this was a population of a young urban cohort of color, and they were looking at adolescents, so that's 12 to 17, as well as young adults, so that's 18 to 25. And if they used marijuana recreationally, the chances that they went on to develop a heroin use disorder or another opioid use disorder within it was like the next 2 decades. And it was striking to see these bar graphs about how quickly that went up. What can you say in terms of this connection between marijuana use and other drug use, particularly in those vulnerable populations?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misinformation around the term gateway, the term which I'm glad you didn't use, because that term gateway is thrown around and it's sort of meaningless at this point. You either have people that say it that don't understand what they mean, what they even mean by it. It's become a very loaded term. You have plenty of people who, the majority of people who have used marijuana will not use other drugs, but the vast, vast, vast majority, almost all, 98, 99% of those who used other drugs started with marijuana. So it depends on, there's no controversy that if you use marijuana, you are simply more likely to use other drugs than if you didn't use marijuana. That's just a statistical fact. It doesn't mean that there's a causal link that you have to use other drugs. No, it doesn't mean that, it's not like gravity, whereas, if I drop this AirPods case, if I let it go, that it's causal, it's going to drop. There's no other thing that's going to happen. We're not saying that if you use marijuana, it's like that. It's with other drugs. That's not the relationship. But there is a relationship of some kind. It's not a direct causal link, but there is, and that is something that we have to look into more. Some scientists think that there's something in the brain that makes you crave other drugs once you've kind of, used up all of your THC. I mean, it's kind of like you now want something else. There are other theories there. Obviously the human condition is complex. There's some people that are more risk taking than others. There's some people that when they dip their toe in the water, they want to put their whole body in. Others get scared when they dip their toe and they run away. I mean, it's complex, but there's no doubt that you are more likely to use those other drugs. And so there is a link. It needs to be looked into more. I tweeted a graph yesterday showing that the rate of fatal overdoses in Colorado, which legalized marijuana in 2012, since that year of legalization, it's skyrocketed. Does that mean that marijuana is the reason? I'm not sure, but definitely marijuana didn't stop it, because it's not being stopped, it's going. And that is often what we hear, is that marijuana could be an exit drug, not an entry drug. And that is not really supported by any evidence.
No, and I agree with you on that. And as an addiction psychologist who actively treats people, who's oversaw rehab programs, I can attest to that. I've got a few slides in my deck that actually talk about the information we have is the opposite of that. It's not an exit drug for a number of reasons. But I want to take just a second, because my next question had to do with these common misconceptions that we get repeated. But to circle back on this idea of gateway, because I agree that is a very loaded term. And there's the association that is clearly there. The way that I look at this, I'd love to get your take on this, is that what it literally does is open a path forward for a young person to progress. It doesn't mean that you're going to do it. And the way that I illustrate this is I say, so like if you had a kid and that kid had a best friend, this kid has never used any substances. And so the best friend walks up with a bag of heroin and says, hey, do you want to tie off and inject? That kid is going to say no, like that. That bar is never going to get jumped, but because the perceived risk is too high, right? There's no one's going to say yes. But if instead they start, say, vaping, which they're more likely to say yes to, or using pot because isn't it a medicine and legal anyway and just a plant and not as bad, then they've already started identifying as a drug user, identifying as someone who does illegal things, because even under the age of 21, it's still illegal. And they're self-selecting themselves into a group where they're far more likely to come in contact with some Xanax or cocaine or maybe some Percocets, right? Or some Norcos. And eventually you snort cocaine first before you inject it, because that seems more palatable. People don't just start with injecting heroin. That's usually how I try to describe it, because we hear that story all the time.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this does not start with a needle. This starts with things that are seemingly much more innocuous. And that's why I shudder when I sometimes hear parents say, well, I'm so glad it's marijuana, that at least they're not using, all this scary fentanyl that I'm seeing, or the heroin. They're very rarely would they be starting with heroin or fentanyl. I mean, that is not the case. Right. And, I think we have to do a lot more education there. Yeah. So along those lines with education, though, we hear leaders, right? And I've done a couple of events virtually in Pennsylvania recently where their governor and lieutenant of governor are really saying a lot of things that are simply untrue about marijuana in attempt to legalize it, like it's not addictive and so forth. We also hear a lot of chatter about how it's useful for PTSD, despite the fact, I worked in the VA, trained in the VA for 3 years. The last thing you want someone with PTSD to do is to smoke pot. As citizens,
How do people, when they hear this, if they're concerned about the fact that leaders are saying things that are not true, what recourse do people have? How can they try to do something about this?
They have to make their voices heard, and sometimes in creative ways. I mean, whether it's obviously letter drives and, getting as much mail to somebody is great, but you need to show up. You need to show up at virtual town halls. You need to call into the teletown halls that these officials often have, because they do have interactions with the broader community. You need to, once this pandemic is over, follow them around in terms of their events. They go to events, they speak at public events. You should go to those public events and make your voice heard. For a lot of these politicians, though, this is not a top issue for them. Pennsylvania is an interesting case because you have a lieutenant governor where this is like his top issue, and he like proudly flies the pot flag as much as he can. But you have a governor who essentially, I actually ran into the governor of Pennsylvania 2 years ago randomly and asked him about marijuana, and he was so uninterested in talking about it. He didn't care. He basically said as much, and he said, talk to my lieutenant governor about it. It was just kind of like, that's his issue. And I think he got so sick of the lieutenant governor talking about it that he finally said, yeah, fine, okay, I agree. I'll talk about it too. But and it's also a way to get somebody some news. So it's, I don't think anyone has ever heard of any lieutenant governor of any state if you didn't live in that state. And even if you lived in that state, I bet you 80% of its inhabitants didn't know who it was. So this is a great way to kind of, stand out. It's a great PR move. I do think that lieutenant governor happens to be very much, a believer, whereas the governor is not. So I think that you have to just keep getting your voices heard. You got to keep putting pressure on local officials.
All right. Well, that's helpful. So you use your voice, and I think that
Absolutely.
Ultimately that's what I try to do as well. Because unlike the special interests and the lobbyists and the corporations, we are not bankrolled by millions or billions of dollars. All we have is our voice and our platform.
That's right.
And that's a good link, I think, to my next question, which has to do with the political process here. Luke had actually asked a question about the Safe Banking Act. I do want to touch on that. But also, I want to start a little bit smaller here in Illinois, where I'm based. How we saw this roll out was, for those who cared about public health, who cared about addiction, extremely concerning, where a bill was first dropped, like the entire 550-page document with less than a month left in the session. And what happened, it was negotiated without anyone from the medical society being able to be at the table, without anyone from addiction science being at the table. They asked for like a sheet, but then decided what got in there and what didn't.
Yeah.
But then what happened actually was that, because there were a lot of problems with that bill, to cut to the chase, they actually, instead of amending the bill, they hijacked a bill that had already passed the House in the General Assembly here, amended that so that they didn't have to debate. It basically just got rammed through. No one even had time to read it. And that was really really hard to watch. It felt like a failure of government. And we're seeing similar things. And even after the fact, we saw articles in the Chicago Tribune and some Times showing hundreds of thousands of donations. There's now a scandal with one of the biggest marijuana producers in the country, certainly here in Illinois, GTI, about a pay-for-play scheme. How does all this fit into the national side of things in terms of the Safe Banking Act, the corruption in the process? And is this standard? Do we see these sorts of tactics at the state level across the country and nationally? Or is this just standard Illinois politics, business as usual?
Yeah, I mean, obviously Illinois and a couple other states, but Illinois is up there, has a little bit of reputation. In fact, I feel like I could have written a whole chapter on Illinois alone. That was one of the things I was rushing to put in at the end while this went to press, right before it went to press, was that there were a lot of things about Illinois, but other states too, that I wanted to include. But I wish I could say it's only in Illinois. It is pretty much industry standard. It is something that is, basically, we are promised so much as these things are put forward, and those promises aren't really fulfilled, and there is so much corruption. There's a trial right now, the mayor of Falls City, Massachusetts, and the corruption scandal. There's been so much in Illinois. If you look at who's actually in the industry now versus who pushed this and their family relationships, I talk about that in the book as well. So, and I sad to say, a lot of this is business as usual in this industry. Remember, you have to remember, this is an illegal industry. I mean, people sometimes forget that. This is actually illegal. I don't care if you're in Colorado or in Alabama. This is illegal if you're an American in the United States. What does that mean? It means that if you're willing to get interest and get involved in an illegal industry, we shouldn't be shocked that maybe you've done other illegal things or will do other slightly unethical, if not maybe still legal things as well. So we shouldn't be that surprised, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and so along those lines, and I know so I've been fascinated being plugged into this about how much interest I could take in banking. But could you explain to folks who might not be in the know about the Safe Banking Act, what is really going on here, and why is it such a big deal to just be able to use banks?
Yeah, well, I think that we're often told that this is really that we need the marijuana industry to use banks because they have so much cash lying around, and it's a public safety problem because you don't want to have cash lying around. You're going to be a target for burglary, etc. And the reality is very, very different. First of all, most marijuana establishments actually do take some form of credit or debit card. So it's not just cash lying around. They also take other things, Bitcoins and other, electronic means of paying. So this idea that there's these large, huge things of cash lying around, I think is a bit of a red herring. It's really about getting involved in the financial system so that you can get investors, so that you can get the hedge funds, so that you can get the major institutional investors to come in and boost your business. And yet they're parading around like this is about cash. By the way, even if it was about cash, jewelry stores take credit card. They have a very expensive product, but they take credit card, and they're still targets of burglaries. And it's not because they also take cash. It's because they have an expensive product. And marijuana is still an expensive product. And so, this idea that, our public safety concerns will all be allayed as long as we can take credit card is really a red herring for these larger issues. So it's really about getting that investment.
To use your title, it's a smokescreen. It's something that they can use to point at, despite really what this is about is massive investments from financial interests.
That's right. Absolutely.
All right. Well, so next question here. In the very last chapter of your book, you broaden things out a little bit, and you talk about that incremental change process that we mentioned earlier, but you start then talking about the decriminalization of all drugs. And in the book, you mentioned that there's right and wrong ways to do that in terms of ways that actually maximize public health versus create problems. So learning from what happened with marijuana, thinking about what does decriminalization look like? How do you do it? And I want to weave in also, we got a question about this specifically about how do you decriminalize marijuana for the single user without legalizing sales? So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll take the last question first. So, I think there are ways to decriminalize. If you think about how we treat speeding, we give people a speeding ticket, and if you're a repeat offender or even a first-time offender, you got to go to some class, you got to go to some treatment, essentially, to learn how to drive better and to not make the same mistake again. But we want to discourage speeding, knowing that there will be plenty of people who still speed, and there will be plenty of people that still speed and don't have any problem with speeding. They don't get into a crash or have any issues. There will be people that don't have any issues with marijuana, that use it occasionally, that use it even semi-regularly and don't have issues. Fine, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to still discourage the use, because the use can still have very profound impacts for some people and for a growing proportion of people with today's high potency marijuana. So there are ways to do that. There are models we can look at where we do not have to legalize the use of, and the sales, I should say, of marijuana. The first question was about the broader other drugs.
Yeah. Right? So when we talk broadly about decrim, what is good decrim versus what is harmful decrim?
Yeah. So I think harmful decrim is something that is essentially de facto legalization without any interest in connecting to the public health systems. There are hundreds of thousands of people that go to the ER every year because of their marijuana use, because it's reached the point where they're having a panic attack or a psychotic episode. Those people probably need some help. They don't just need a night in the hospital and then they get released. Frankly, we don't treat any substance user well, let alone marijuana. It's not just marijuana that we don't do this well with, but really anything. So we need to do a lot better generally about this. But this idea of just giving people a slap on the wrist if you can afford it, and then moving on, is not really a health-oriented issue. We'd never treat any other, true health issue like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I think in my mind, part of this is an intersection with a system that could help you. Right.
Yes.
And when we think about, say, harm reduction in a broader sense, when you talk about safe injection facilities or needle
Yeah.
exchanges, all those sorts of things, the idea behind it not only is, say, preventing HIV or
Yeah.
other infectious diseases, but is saying you've got a relationship with our organization. So when you're ready for
Yeah.
change, we've got a hotline to treatment so that you can
Yeah.
actually get better. And
Yeah.
so kind of what I'm hearing you saying, and I know what my concerns have to do with, is saying we have this opportunity potentially to intervene earlier when, like, the canary is dying in the coal mine
Yeah.
versus
Yeah.
before everything collapses. You take that
Yes.
away and you're going to get a lot more end stage disease rather than stage 2 cancer or even stage 3.
Absolutely. No, that's exactly right. And we need to also do a much better job at linking up those services with people and motivate them to get help. I don't think we
Mhm.
do a great job at that. And I haven't seen a lot of research even saying that a lot of this outreach can lead to treatment entry. I'd like to see that some more. But yes, generally we want to bring people to get them help. By the way, sometimes you're not always ready for help. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't get it. And those are tough questions we need to have as a
Mm.
society. But I can tell you, we have a person who used to lead the drug czar's office who admitted to me that if he didn't get arrested for a DUI, he'd still be an alcoholic. That
Right.
arrest for a DUI got him treatment. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone, you have to go through the criminal justice system to get treatment. Of course not. You shouldn't have to do that. We don't want that to happen. That's expensive and costly and demoralizing. And there's a lot of reasons why that's not a good idea. But if that's the only way, we need to have some discussions as a society about, well, okay, well, what does that mean? And well, how should
Mhm.
our policies be both humane, but also humane to that person's recovery and getting that person into recovery? It's something we really have to
Yeah.
grapple with more intelligently, I think.
Well, absolutely. And so we're getting towards the end of the hour. So the last question that I have for you today, this is a pretty good segue, has to do with the impact on children and how we speak to them about this. Because you mentioned that when we talk about decrim, right? And when we talk about legalization, one of the most harmful elements, and I've literally heard this out of the mouth of a 16-year-old, is them saying it's legal, so it must be fine. Like I've
Yeah.
heard someone in a drug
Oh,
treatment
yeah.
program as a kid say that, right?
Yeah.
Because when we enact these policies, there's things that are either explicitly or implicitly communicated to
Yeah.
everybody, but also to young people. And
Yeah.
particularly, like, I have been in high schools giving
Yeah.
assemblies back when that was a thing. And in the Q&A part, heard all sorts of things, everything from, well, how could marijuana be bad if it cures cancer,
Yeah.
to, like, I know plenty of people who smoke pot and they're fine.
Yeah.
So with all of this going on, with all of this noise, with all of this messaging, how, I guess, two-part question, how do you get through to kids about this when you speak to audiences
Yeah.
of young people? And then how can the rest of us who don't have the platform that you do and the background that you do actually get through to young people to get them to understand?
Well, either way, you don't need a platform to say this. I like to talk to kids in a way that respects their intelligence and respects the fact that everybody has an internet connection mostly and can find information out, and that they're bombarded by so much misinformation. First, I tell them to, really search the information themselves, independently investigate the truth. I put this in the book, even Wikipedia is not always the best source. Sometimes it can lead you to some good sources, but that can't be your only source. If you want to understand the science, really read it. And now we can also say, if you believe the CDC and the NIH when it comes to COVID-19, how can you not believe them when it comes to marijuana? Or how are they? Are they just wrong on this, but right on everything else? So you really have to think about that. But number two, and by the way, I told us the other day, but just a side note, I haven't really told many people this at all, but I had a celebrity, A-list celebrity, randomly message me on Twitter, and we had a spirited exchange, and I'll leave it at that. But that's one thing I said is, wait a minute, you're out there saying COVID-19 is real, which I obviously agree with, and that we should listen to the CDC, which I obviously agree with too, but not for marijuana. And he didn't really have anything, he couldn't say anything back to that. But the second thing I say, which is maybe even more effective to a young person, is they need to do some research on what the tobacco industry did to my and older generations in terms of thinking of our brains as dollar signs, as their lifelong customers, because that's what the tobacco industry did. And they should know, whether they like it or not, and maybe they love it, their brains are dollar signs right now, and for these corporate conglomerates that are looking to profit off of misinformation, misery, and addiction and dependency. That's what it's about. So you might be fine with it, but just you should understand that you're essentially being used. People like you are being used. Young people are being used. They're being used by an industry banking on you believing their lies and believing their BS. And I think that can be more effective. And unfortunately, I guess, than saying, the Lancet Journal recently said that if you use, you're 5 times more likely to get psychosis, schizophrenia. At some point, the human mind, these numbers all jumble together. I mean, it's like, there's been a lot of research on, like, to a lot of people, what's the difference between 5% and 15%? Not much, but in science, that's a huge difference. I mean, like that actually is that's threefold difference.
Like we take baby aspirins because they reduce the chance of heart attack by like 0.01%. It's like really minuscule.
Yeah, and so we don't comprehend these numbers as well. That's why this book, I insisted there be footnotes, even though the publisher didn't want them. But this book was trying to also be about the stories and the science could back. That's why there's 350 citations. That I still back it with the science, but often these stories and these narratives can be even more effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I use something similar when I speak to young people. I actually, like, when I talk about vaping, nicotine, or marijuana, I actually have, before I even get to any of that, like a little 10-minute module on, well, what is marketing, and what does marketing to kids look like? What does marketing to like 40 or 50-year-olds look like? And now what does this look like to you? And, I pull up the pictures from Illinois dispensaries of lollipops and candy bars and the images and all of that. But so we are almost out of time for today. If you have to leave the audience with something about your new book, about your message, what would you like your last word to be today?
Keep an open mind and know that we are basically in the beginning of the throes of the normalization of this substance and other substance, and to really stay the course on education, because no matter what happens with this law or that law, this president's point of view, that president's point of view, what the Senate does, the fact that we have to keep educating about something that there is so much misinformation about does not change. In fact, it means that as the laws become more relaxed, we have to work even harder. We have to, our work becomes even more relevant. So I would say to sort of keep the faith and understand that, 80 years ago, if you told the people that first found out that smoking and cigarettes and tobacco and nicotine were harmful, they were being laughed out of rooms, even though the science was showing that. And, we had to wait 80 years for their work to be redeemed, essentially. And I think we're going to be in the same circumstance here. So, keep the faith, keep going, keep educating. We're all needed. People like you, Aaron, are needed more than ever.
Well, thank you. And likewise. And for those who want to get more involved, learnaboutsam.org, right? That's where they can find more.
Learnaboutsam.org. You can get the book at smokescreenbook.com or Amazon or any bookstore that's out there. You can pick it up. And like Aaron said, there is an Audible, and there's some funny there's a funny story behind the Audible. And but anyhow, we can talk about that later. But I just want to thank everybody. And please email us info@learnaboutsam.org if you'd like more information, you want us to work with you. And again, hopefully you will like the book.
Fantastic. I know I did. I did. So thank you again so much, Kevin, for coming on today. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. If you want to get in touch, please reach out to us on social media. We're both very responsible. Unless you're trolling, then I tend not to. But what's that? Disagree, don't be disagreeable. Everything is good in that vein. So take care, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your week.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Aaron. Bye-bye. Thanks.